Okay, so this is the third and final part of tonight's lecture. I will be stopping after the third part. We're going to kind of talk about colonial culture and the colonies at large. I won't finish this PowerPoint. We'll be using it in our next class, but I'll get through probably about a third of it is what I'm trying to do. So here at the beginning, we have the different colonists and the settled areas. So you have the French colonies in New France, centered largely on Canada, largely as trading colonies, but also along the Mississippi. And the major city in these colonies was New Orleans, which was the major sort of French trading point in what would eventually be the southern United States at the southern terminus of the Mississippi, which would connect to the other French shipping routes through the Great Lakes and up the St. Lawrence River. Again, the French colonies were trading colonies. The number of French settlers was few and not necessarily permanent. Largely, they would settle for the purpose of facilitating trade. Trade for a few years and go home. Trade until you die, and then leave the money to your family. They were not largely permanent colonists, even though the colonies themselves were rather permanent, and thus their population is only about 15,000 people, which is quite small. The 13 colonies, the British colonies, these had a population of about 250,000, which is obviously much larger than the French colonies, but still a relatively small population. And most cities would have been quite small, and we'll talk about them in a moment. These were, again, still largely agrarian colonies, and especially in the Chesapeake colonies, trading colonies. The Carolina colonies down here, farming colonies, plantation colonies, and Georgia was a part of the Carolina colony at this time. Again, largely plantation colonies using slave labor for agricultural production. Relatively small overall population. The Spanish colonies were different. This was more of a permanent structure. And the Spanish colonies were different than the French and European and British colonies, also in the way that the cultural hierarchy was delineated. So imagine a hierarchy as a pyramid. I think I've used this example in class. At the top of the pyramid you have the ruler, then on the sort of next level beneath the ruler you have the elite, then the next level the sub-elite, and then the commoners. In the British colonies and the French colonies, this pyramid would have largely resembled the pyramids in England. The native peoples, such as they were, that weren't killed or driven away, especially in the British colonies, they would be killed or driven away. In the French colonies, less so. Would have no place in the hierarchy. The hierarchy consisted of the British or French settlers. In the Spanish colonies, the native peoples did have a place in the hierarchy. Granted, the lowest place, but they still had a place. They were a part of the hierarchical structure. The Spanish were not trying to displace them. They were trying to incorporate them into their hierarchy. And nothing emphasizes this more than the sub-elites would have been the population that we call the mestizos. If you remember when I talked about Donna Maria in class, Donna Maria was the lover of Cortez, and their son Martin is often known as the first mestizo. The mestizo is the result of a mixed race union between the Spanish and the Indian peoples, or the indigenous peoples. And the mestizos operated as a sub-elite in the Spanish colonies. They would occupy important positions, largely trading and government positions, and they would have a place in the Spanish colonial hierarchy. Not as high as the Spanish, but still a place, which partially explains why the population was so large. This kind of gives you the population in 1750. where the after the last was population about 1700. So you see the population growing. You have New France with about 70,000, more permanent settlers emerging. New England and New York with about 500,000. Pennsylvania with about 250,000. Chesapeake colonies about 400,000. And then when you get into the South, the lower South and back country, which would be Georgia, you see smaller populations because, again, there's relatively few settlers. It's largely a small aristocracy ruling a slave population that's laboring on the plantations. Northern New Spain, which would be Florida, very sparsely populated, only 20,000. And then total number of Indians or Native Americans, 1.5 million within the colonial regions. So what about Indian culture? Well, it had obviously changed as a result of interactions with the European colonists. In a way, this was pushing them into a more advanced hierarchy, at least economically speaking and politically speaking, than they had before. And in no way is this more emphasized than in the Indian use of white weaponry, guns and muskets and horses. So the Indians initially would not have fought on horseback. They would have fought on foot using stone or wood or perhaps some metal, but not many weapons. Once they interact with the white settlers, they use white weaponry, guns, riding in a battle on horses, using metal weapons instead of wood or bone or stone weapons. They also began to develop a hunger for European goods, European trade goods, European consumer goods, especially among the Indian elite. So they would want to sort of show status, perversely enough, among the Indian tribes by adopting white consumer goods as signs of status. So you see the Indian sort of local economy becoming dependent on the Europeans, and they're only remaining competitive militarily due to their use of white weaponry. The Indians countered by organizing themselves into a larger political unit, the Iroquois Confederacy, which became dominant by 1750, but all the same was unable to sort of stop the growth of the white European colonies. And they had to deal with an ever-increasing population of European and British settlers. And we saw this in the first map, and then the sort of, on the last page, the population breakdown, where you can see the population, increased within about 50 years, almost tripling. In addition to the European population almost tripling, the Indian population was declining, largely due to disease. Again, like I said in a previous lecture, the disease exchange went largely one way, with the Indians being susceptible to European disease, but not vice versa. So the population of the Indians at the sort of time of first interaction with the Europeans was about 10 million. By about 1800, so after about 100 years of, well, 200 years really of settlement, a 90% decline. So we see the Indians changing from nomadic tribes to mounted tribes, to being more settled, to having a hierarchical structure that resembled that of a more settled society rather than a nomadic society. And we also see the use of horses, which they got largely from the Spanish, but also sometimes from the English and the French as well. But the English and the French didn't want the Indians to have horses, so they largely got them from the Spanish. And they use these for both hunting, but largely buffalo, and also to fight the European settlers. The Plains Indians, the Sioux and the Comanche, were more successful after the introduction of horses than the Native Americans in New England and New York, largely because they hadn't yet really interacted with European settlers, only European traders. So they hadn't really had to compete with them for land and resources, where the Indian tribes in New England and New York had. And you can see this is the different tribes that made up the Iroquois Confederacy in New York and a very small part of Pennsylvania. And this is a map I showed you, a couple lectures ago, and it shows you the different Indian tribes that were present when the white settlers arrived. Okay. All right. So what about the Spanish borderlands? And this is where the Plains Indians would have had interactions with the Spanish. It was characterized largely by mission settlements, monks and priests settling there to try to convert the Indian tribes to Christianity, where the permanent settlers are relatively limited. That doesn't mean that the priests wouldn't spread diseases to the tribes. They would, but they were good enough to baptize everyone before they killed them. Well, they didn't deliberately kill them, but died through disease. So these were largely mission settlements with the goal of converting the Indians to Christianity. This is a woodcut of Franciscan friars baptizing an Indian baby. And a lot of the Indian tribes did convert to Christianity, at least superficially. These show you the Spanish missions, the Spanish mission paths of the missions, the mission settlements. That's basically all it is, to be honest with you. Nothing that exciting. And this shows you Spanish territory, French territory, English territory, Dutch territory. So you can see, again, just a different way of showing where the French settled, where the English settled, where the Dutch settled. And then again, the size of the Spanish Empire, and that the Spanish settlements here were largely missionary in nature. The Spanish settlement in California was largely agricultural in nature. And California is still America's breadbasket, and in this time even more so. The agricultural productivity of the California river valleys is one of the highest in the world. And even today, most of our food that we eat in America, and maybe not, fully 51%, but a plurality, 45% or so, comes from California. So the Indians were not forced to convert, but if they did, they were unable to leave the Spanish settled areas. They were sort of trapped, and the only way they could return would be to convert. But that said, they didn't really need to force the Indians to convert. A lot of them did on their own, because converting enabled them to have better treatment on the part of the European colonists. Okay, we're going to talk about the French Crescent, which is essentially the St. Lawrence River Valley, which is Quebec and Montreal, and the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes area, and the Mississippi River Valley with the major settlement of New Orleans. This was a natural increase in population, not from immigration. Remember, there weren't very many immigrants, because the immigrants largely came as temporary and then ended up staying on. Most of the settlers created farming communities, but trade was a large part of the economy. So, individual settlers might be farmers, but they could only exist as farmers because of the economy created by trade, if that makes any sense. And again, stretched from the St. Lawrence River to New Orleans. New France was religiously based, much like the Spanish. The primary goal was religion, but they understood the importance of trade, and much like the Spanish, made a lot of money from trade goods. And they also, like the Spanish, had better relationships with the Indians, forming alliances and trade relationships when necessary, and often competing with the Spanish and the English with Indian help. I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick up in our next class at this point.